Greetings, friends and comrades, and welcome to a very special episode of Emancipations podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Tudd, and I'm joined by Professor Adam Hanieh at Exeter University, who's the author of 6 different books, from Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, to Money, Markets, and Monarchies, the Gulf Corporation Council, and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, in which was awarded the British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. Congratulations on that. And more recently, Professor Hanieh has a forthcoming book with Verso Books, which I've had the pleasure to read. It'll be out very soon. It is entitled Resisting Erasure, Capital, Imperialism and Race in Palestine. Very excited for this book to come out. I think it's going to give us the type of background analysis that is so often lacking when we examine the genocide in Gaza and the tragedy that's been unfolding before our eyes in the last couple of years. I want to begin with a acknowledgement of the depravity and the brutality of this current genocide. In some ways, it has left us stunned and in a kind of sleepwalking state for quite a while now. A lot of your work is about understanding the Palestinian political economy, both as subordinated to a settler colonial logic, and I want to invite you to explain what that means. We often use that phrase, but you guys in the book, your co-authors, do a very nice job of actually putting meat on the bones of exactly what we mean by settler colonial. A settler colonial form of domination is distinct from what the Palestinian state is also subordinated to, or what the Palestinian civil society and Palestinians are subordinated to, which is a kind of regional capitalist capture from a kind of rentier style finance capital that is ultimately tied into the oil economy. And crude capitalism is a very, very important intervention that shows the centrality of fossil capital and the way that it shapes contemporary capitalism. But first, perhaps, Professor Hanieh, we could start with an understanding of the unique situation of political economy, how the regional dynamics play into the Palestinian situation, and how also the settler colonial structure plays in. Would you mind sort of giving us an overlay, an overview of this?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for allowing me to join you today. Well, there's a few things, I guess, to unpack here. The first thing is one of the things we try to do in this new Verso book, Resisting Erasure, myself and my co-authors, is we try to, if you like, de-exceptionalize the way that Palestine is often understood, in the sense that people often try to explain the dynamics of Israel or what is happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza or the West Bank or wherever, solely through the lens of the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, or the Israeli political establishment, the Israeli military, separate from the dynamics of the bigger region, the Middle East as a whole. So one of the arguments we really try to make in the book is that it's essential to foreground Palestine and Israel's particular place in American power in the context of the Middle East, and in particular, the centrality of the Middle East to the global oil economy. And so we try to make the argument that thinking about Palestine requires us to think about how oil emerged to be so central to contemporary capitalism, particularly in the post-war, post-Second World War period, and what that meant for American power in the Middle East, and in particular, the set of alliances that the US formed between, on one hand, the Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies, in particular Saudi Arabia, and then secondly, Israel as the second kind of major pillar of American power in the region. So it's to try to foreground that regional context in understanding what Palestinians experience today and have since 1948. So to come to your question about the kind of specificities of thinking about settler colonialism, we really try to make the argument that settler colonialism needs to be understood as a form of capitalism, not simply through the way it's often spoken about, which is a kind of eradicationist view, the idea that settler colonies like Australia or Canada or the United States or South Africa have been primarily concerned with eradicating indigenous populations. Now, that obviously that is part of the dynamic of what settler colonialism is, but settler colonialism is a variant of colonial capitalism. It's a variant of the way that capitalism expanded globally through the 20th century and earlier. And what does that mean? It means that it transforms class relations in the areas that it comes to dominate. And that's really important to understand in the context of Palestine, thinking about the ways that this kind of settler colonial expansion into the Middle East that began under the British in the early 20th century, of course, was culminated in the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population in 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. That set in train a whole set of class dynamics, political economy dynamics that implicated Palestinians. And one of the arguments we try to make is that in thinking about this kind of class structure in Palestine, we need to look at the ways in which Palestinian bourgeoisie, Palestinian capital, was connected to the emergence of the oil economy in the Gulf states, particularly through the 1970s. Palestinians, being a dispossessed and largely diaspora refugee population, much like Iraqis, much like Lebanese, it meant that Palestinian capital was also displaced, and many of Palestinian capitalists found their way to the Gulf states in the 70s and later, and became integrated into capital accumulation in those Gulf states. So it's thinking about these kind of cross-border processes, these regional processes, when we're trying to analyze the particular nature of capitalism in Palestine.
One of the questions that a lot of socialists have had about the class dynamics that are unique to a settler colonial mode of production is, of course, this idea that I think we ultimately get from Lenin in his notion that you can have a capitalist social order with overlapping modes of production, where effectively older, more retrograde forms of feudalist domination coexist with more contemporary forms of capitalist mode of production. And if you look at a thinker like Frantz Fanon, one of his arguments was that a colonial class composition will not possess the means for adequately or successfully organizing vis-a-vis a working class, that the working class is destabilized in this context. And that was one question I had, which is, could you speak more broadly about the condition of the working class in the region and how these overlapping systems of colonialism still, what effects do they have on the potential for organizing class solidarity in the societies that might be beneficial for socialist objectives? Because again, Fanon's one of his arguments, and there's a very interesting new book of debates, posing a debate between Fanon and Pierre Bourdieu on Algeria, where Fanon says, look, the Algerian working class cannot be the revolutionary agent. It actually falls to the peripheral, it falls to the peasantry, it falls to lumpenproletarian elements, precisely because of the way that colonialism fragments the possibility of class unity. Could you speak perhaps more generally about how class appears in this context where you have these overlapping modes. And am I right to presume that when we speak about the working class in the Middle East and even in Palestine in particular, what actually are we talking about? If that does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would say, and again, it really depends on whereabouts we're speaking in the region here. And let me just maybe give a quick, survey of some of these different cases. So to begin with the Gulf, it's very important to think, as I said, around the nature of capitalism in the Gulf. Now, people sometimes, I think, make the erroneous conclusion that the Gulf is some kind of feudal hangover, which I think is completely false. These are capitalist societies. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so forth are capitalist societies. They have a capitalist class. They also have ruling families, ruling monarchies, as part of the kind of political structure. But one of the things we need to think about here when we're talking about class and state in the Gulf is the ways in which the ruling monarchies and individual family members of the ruling family are themselves part of the capitalist class in the Gulf. We, I think, need to reject the kind of Weberian separation, if you like, of the political and the economic or the state from the forms of class power that exist. Now, that doesn't mean that the capitalist class is entirely constituted by the ruling families. There are, if you look at the way that capital operates in the Gulf, you have these huge conglomerates that extend across the entire circuit of capital, productive sectors, financial sectors, the realization of value, and so forth. These conglomerates, these diversified conglomerates, often have their roots in earlier merchant families. And as I said, they often are controlled by members of the ruling family. They link closely with the state, and the state is part of the ways in which the accumulation of these conglomerates is made possible. So when we're talking then about the nature of labor in the Gulf, there is something very distinctive that really is important to kind of foreground. And that is that the majority of workers in the Gulf states are made up of temporary non-citizen migrant workers. There is really no other place on the planet where you have such a high degree of a working class that is constituted by non-citizen migrant labor. Now, these migrant workers are brought from across the world. Historically, many came from the Arab region. Today, a larger proportion come from South Asia, in particular India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, East Africa, as well as further afield, the Philippines, and increasingly China. So just to emphasize again, we're talking about more than half of the labor force in these Gulf monarchies are made up of these citizen workers. So when we're looking at, for example, the fantastical building projects, skyscrapers, construction, that really is part of the core of capital accumulation for these conglomerates. The workforce that produces this kind of urban environment is made up of these workers who have no route to citizenship or any kind of permanent residency. Their precarity means that they can be legally deported at any moment. And so moments of crisis, economic crisis, such as the 2008 global crash, workers were simply sent home. And this displaces the impact of crisis away from the Gulf onto neighboring labor-sending countries like India, for instance. So understanding these kind of the class composition, the particular nature of the way that the working classes come into being, how that connects to capital accumulation in the Gulf, and how that connects to this kind of state-class relation is really key. Moving away from the Gulf, sorry, Damien, did you want to come in there?
No, that's excellent. I do have a question about how oil fits in, but I think we'll get to that later. Please.
Sure. So moving away from the Gulf, I think this kind of, if you like, breaking with conceptions of class that think of workers only as citizens is important, because today the whole of the Middle East is a site of massive levels of human displacement, people dispossessed both internally as well as across borders. It's something like 1 in 3 people who are dispossessed globally are located in the Middle East. They've been displaced from countries in the Middle East. We're talking, I think, about 40 million was the last figure that I've seen. 40 million people. So that means if we look at a country like Jordan, for example, or a country like Lebanon, which is host to many of these displaced people. About 20 to 30% of the population of both those countries are made up of people who have been refugees or other kinds of displaced people. These are not just kind of objects of humanitarian intervention. They are inevitably classed in the process of their dispossession. They become part of how labor and conditions of work unfold in these countries. So again, thinking about class not just as those who hold citizen, but the Syrian refugee who's in Jordan working in a garment factory, for instance, needs to be understood as part of how the Jordanian working class is constituted, likewise with Lebanon and so forth. So I think that's a very important point to think about, this kind of overlapping of migration and labor across the entire region. To come to the question of Palestine and the particular kinds of ways that labor was formed under settler colonialism, under particularly the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza since 1967. In those early years of that occupation post 1967, Palestinian labor was, if you like, a cheap reserve army of labor for Israeli capitalism. So you had Palestinians both in the West Bank and Gaza Strip who moved on a daily basis or very short-term basis into Israel. They worked in sectors like the construction sector was very important. The agricultural sector was very important. Some kind of manufacturing sectors, and in this way, Israeli economists talk about this post 1967 period as being the Palestinian boom. In terms of what it did for the Israeli economy as this kind of cheap reserve army of labor that again could just be sent home at moments of they actually literally just went home back into the West Bank or Gaza after their employment. So that structure has kind of evolved since 1967, and particularly in the last couple of decades, with the hardening of movement control, the establishment of a system of permits, checkpoints, regulating the movement of Palestinian labor. It's changed dramatically. Obviously, in the case of Gaza, over the last 10 years or so, we don't see the movement of Gazan workers into, and I'm obviously talking here pre the genocide, but into the Israeli economy. The West Bank, that does exist and has existed much longer, but again, it's more regulated. It's kind of a reserve, a pool of labor that can be drawn upon depending on the economic and political circumstances of Israeli capital. So that's kind of, I think, a broad brushstrokes of some of the labor dynamics. Obviously, in this is not to deny the importance of domestic citizen working classes across the region. Egypt really stands out with a history of militant labor struggles in different areas. We also need to think here about the way that rural working classes have been formed. Many of the kind of informal workers in urban areas have come to those urban areas after kind of the structural adjustment processes of the 80s and 90s, where people were pushed off the land into kind of urban sectors as and joined kind of urban slums and informal sectors. So, you know, it's quite complex to think about these different segments, but I think part of the point I'm trying to make is to think about labor expansively in its cross-border natures, not just in the kind of classic idea of the male trade unionist in a factory, if you like.
And I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the status of labor rights in the region. If you were to make an international comparison to other regions, how does the Middle East compare? And I also was curious about the role of the diaspora across these various states. For example, anyone that travels the Middle East knows that a Western Union station is on every block almost. And there's sort of a transfer system. What is the role of that at an economic level? And how does the diaspora interact with questions of the working class situation in these regions? So those are two questions. And I'm also very curious about this post-1980s move to the casualization of labor in the region. We, I suppose, after 2008, have experienced this quite a lot in the United States through what they call the rise of the gig economy. But I suppose in the Middle East, this gig economy was existing far before we had to deal with it. And it's a quite monstrous thing for the possibility of organizing, of course. So first, could you speak to the general condition of labor rights, the general success or failure, kind of map that in comparison, and then speak about diaspora and the question of casualization?
Yes. So the question of labor rights obviously is really key, and again, just to begin in the Gulf in this respect. So I mentioned that the majority of the labor force are made up of non-citizen migrant workers. Their entry into the country and into the workplace is regulated through something called the kafala system, which is basically, and I think this is very interesting because there are comparisons I think that can be made here with labor systems and the way labor systems have been evolving in other parts of the world, such as the UK, where I am, or the United States, in the sense that what the kafala system does is it gives citizens of the Gulf states the direct control over these non-citizen migrant workers. They're connected to a permit system that is through and owned by citizens and local businesses. So in a way, what it does is it subcontracts the management of migrant populations to the citizen population. They're the ones who are looking to see if there's any kind of infraction, people turn up to work or go on strike or do anything like that. And they have the ability to terminate those permits and just send the worker home legally. It's not illegal. It's not a violation of any kind of labor rights. It's a legal right as the holder of that permit, as the kafil. So I said there's comparisons that can be made in Western contexts. You know, for example, the way that we, as university professors, need to monitor the immigration status of our students, or doctors need to check the immigration status of their patients. Landlords need to do so in terms of rental and so forth. So this kind of subcontracting of migration control as a form of labor control, in essence, really kind of changes, is part of how that relationship between the citizen and the state is constituted, and if you like, binds the citizen ever more tightly, those who do play this kind of role, with the interests of the state itself.
Can I ask a question about this? It seems
Yeah.
that would naturally foment a type of intensification of racism as well.
Absolutely, these processes are always racialized
By design. By design. In a way.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of examples that you can think about and that you can see in the ways that migrant workers are spoken about. Now you mentioned the point of remittances, which is really, really, really important. So these migrant workers, they're present in the Gulf. They're working in retail, construction, all sorts of activities. The vast majority, more than 90% of private sector workers are migrant workers, whereas the public sector in the Gulf is made up much more of the citizen population. So as they work, they get paid their salaries, and the bulk of that money, as with many migrants globally, gets sent back to their families in their country of origin. Now, what this means is, I think, thinking about these kinds of remittance flows is really important, because, as I mentioned earlier, at times of crisis, economic crisis, or whatever it might be, workers might be deported and sent home, and then you will see potentially a large drop in those remittance flows. Either less workers are coming over, or workers have been sent home and they're no longer able to remit their wages. So what this does is it displaces, I think, spatially, the impact of capitalist crisis away from Dubai, for example, onto the countryside in Bangladesh, where about 90% of migrant workers go to the Gulf. Something like that. So you can see these kinds of dynamics of the way that these states experience crises, like the 2008 crisis, or the COVID crisis is another example, very clear example here, where the remittance corridor is a transmission belt of crisis from these zones of accumulation to rural and other areas in the labor-sending countries.
What about the remittance flows coming back the other way into Egypt, Lebanon, etc., from diaspora in the West back in? And how are those funds, that cash, dealt with? What does that go to? Does that go to the basic living costs, or is this central to infrastructural development?
I mean, that's a great question, and it is really important, because way before the so-called refugee crisis of Europe, you had large numbers of young people, in particular from North Africa and elsewhere, working in Europe. In Southern Europe in particular, and sending remittances home. And again, thinking about that moment of the 2008-2009 crisis, which, remember, preceded the uprisings of 2011 in the Middle East. And I think there's a good argument to be made that one of if you like the things that stirred and underpinned those revolts of 2011 was the impact of the global crisis on the populations in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. And one of the things that happened was that the remittance levels dropped. The opportunities for those kind of flows, financial flows, they fell off with the global crisis, because, as with the case in the United States, it was migrant workers who were let off first, sent home in many circumstances. So that kind of experience of crisis, I think, really underlay the later revolts that took place in 2010 and 2011. Directly to your question, though, a lot of those flows are spent personally or at the individual family level, and not necessarily for infrastructure or bigger development projects.
And what does labor struggle look like? Do we see mostly wildcat strikes, unorganized, spontaneous agitation? How frequent is that? Is it common? And also, if you could speak to perhaps that general, maybe you could say if you were to take the temperature of the labor struggles in the region, how would you sort of diagnose that?
Well, again, with the Gulf, despite all of the kinds of structural systems of control that exist over migrant workers, there are repeatedly examples of labor strikes, labor actions that take place. Construction workers are at the forefront of these. I should say labor unions are banned in the Gulf states. So these are illegal strikes and kinds of actions. But you do see, whether it be over unpaid wages, conditions of work, conditions of kind of living, spontaneous kinds of protests. But what happens in those circumstances is, because of this structural system of governing labor, the leaders of those movements are simply sent back home to India, Pakistan, or wherever it might be. So I imagine, I don't know the details around this, but I do know that there are kinds of broader transnational conversations happening among workers in South Asia, some of whom may have spent time in the Gulf, or unions that kind of think about these questions, I think. And that to me is one kind of perhaps potential where there might be some kind of space for labor movements, labor organizing around this. We also, again, I don't want to paint a picture that all work is in kind of this informal or kind of precarious migrant-based work. In again, countries like Egypt, you have a long history of labor organizing, including independent trade unions that have formed outside of the control of the state. This was a really important, again, precursor to the 2011 uprisings in Egypt, and the way that Mubarak was ousted. That kind of independent organizing has continued, as it has elsewhere in the region, in Tunisia and Lebanon. It's important to kind of consider those formal, kind of more traditional, if you like, labor sites.
Now, you had mentioned a bit about the capitalist class and its relationship to fossil fuels and to the oil economy and to the kind of oligarchic families that emerged to compose the capitalist class. Could you give us a sense of the unique accumulation dynamics involved with crude oil, and how that composes a capitalist class that I imagine has very unique features compared to capitalist classes in other regions, given the proximity to the oil and so on? How does the capitalist sort of ruling order look in the Gulf region, and how? Because I think one of your points is that the Gulf region still has a certain hegemony over other states in the Middle East, precisely because of this connection to the oil economy. And I know this is probably the area of work that you're most well known for. But could you give us a sort of picture of that, perhaps?
Yes. Here it's really critical to kind of understand the shift that happened globally in the control of oil through the 1970s and onwards, in the sense that up until that point, most oil globally was controlled by Western oil companies, particularly American and West European oil companies. And these large Western companies, they controlled oil from across the whole value chain, from the extraction of crude oil through its refining and processing, through the infrastructures of transport and marketing, and the sale of oil products, like whether it be liquid fuels like petrol or petrochemicals, to the final consumer. Now, this kind of vertically integrated structure was one of the ways in which Western oil companies dominated the global oil economy. It gave them immense power over any potential competitors. It allowed them to set the price of oil. But what happened as part of kind of the anti-colonial movements of the post-war period, the establishment of OPEC in 1960, but gradually the upstream control of oil, that kind of crude moment extraction from under the ground, initial phase of oil production, came much more under the control of producer governments in places like Saudi Arabia. And this is where you have the origins of these kind of national oil companies controlled by the state in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE. So the Saudi example is really important. The Saudi Aramco, which is by far the biggest oil company in the world today. It's basically controlled by the Saudi state, and it's massive. Its profits, for example, last year exceeded the combined profits of the 5 biggest Western firms: BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, and Total Energies. Those profits combined were less than Aramco. So, this is a shift that's happened globally. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that the Western firms are no longer important, but in terms of the countries like Saudi Arabia, there is this kind of domestic control of their upstream reserves. And the other thing that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years, which is very much connected to the rise of China, is that these national oil companies have themselves become vertically integrated. So they've moved down the value chain into controlling the refining process, petrochemicals. For example, the second largest producer of synthetic rubber in the world today is a Saudi Aramco-controlled company, which is a big shift from what it was 20 years ago. They control tanker fleets, they control petrol stations and fertilizer companies and so forth. So to come to your question of how does this kind of control over oil production and the kind of circulation of oil through its value chain, how does this feed into capital accumulation? So these areas are these companies are state-owned. They remain largely state-owned. Aramco, or the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, or the Kuwait Oil Company, they are largely state-owned. However, there are numerous ways in which these kind of financial surpluses that emerge from the sale of oil recirculate through the state apparatus to the capitalist classes in these countries. So to give you some examples, one very important way is that often there are subsidiaries of these national oil companies that are listed on domestic stock markets. And this is the case throughout the Gulf region. And this allows investors from local investors to kind of grab a share, if you like, of the profits that accrue through these petrodollar surpluses. There's also a lot of investment by the state jointly with local capital, whether it be through these oil companies or through sovereign wealth funds, where there'll be joint projects, joint ventures, grants for land, assistance from the state that kind of helps these conglomerates grow. And that's really important to. I mean, it's not unique in the sense that all capitalism relies upon the state increasingly for its accumulation. We can see this in the US, we can see this in the UK, but it's very evident in the case of the Gulf as well. So you have what emerges around this, a structure of these large business groups or business conglomerates that are multi-sector. They are involved in things like petrochemical production, aluminium, steel, concrete. They own shopping malls. They own agency rights for the distribution of goods that are imported into these states. They are invested heavily and own finance capital, banks, and other kinds of investment, financial investments. And this is kind of the structure integrated closely with the state, but still a capitalist class. And that's really important to understand. So to the regional question, what has happened in the last, basically since the neoliberal period of the 90s and early 2000s, where you saw kind of structural adjustment take place in the wider region, the privatization of state-owned firms, the selling off of land, the opening up to foreign investment. The Gulf capital was a prime beneficiary of this neoliberal experience in the wider Middle East. It was the internationalization of Gulf firms, whether they be state or privately controlled conglomerates, that took over, bought up the land, became integrated into the class structures of Egypt, of Jordan, of Lebanon in this kind of way. So again, thinking about how this internationalization of capital that was concomitant with neoliberal reform really allowed the Gulf to become integrated into the class structures of neighboring Arab countries. But obviously, there's variation in how this happened from country to country, but it's really evident. And this, again, is an important part of understanding the contemporary moment, particularly in a place like Egypt, where the Gulf is really heavily integrated into class and state structures.
It sounds like from your analysis of your work more generally, that predictions about the imminent decline in relative power of this sector of the global economy seem to be quite naive. Is this true in your estimation? I mean, especially given that startling fact that you made about the profitability of Saudi Aramco. It doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. Maybe it's wishful thinking or some type of propaganda to think otherwise. Could you speak to the kind of prognosticators who say, well, the dominance of the Middle East as an oil power will be a thing of the past in our lifetime or something? You know, I think we hear this. At least I've heard of this before. I don't know. What would you say to something like that?
I mean, I do think, as you say, this is a complete fantasy, unfortunately, because obviously the issue of our time is the question of the climate emergency and the ecological collapse. But if we're looking at these oil companies in the Gulf like Aramco, it's very clear, and you can look at their projections around expanding hydrocarbon production. This is not just oil, by the way, it's also gas, natural gas, particularly liquefied natural gas. Their projections, and this is projections backed by capital investments, is to expand dramatically over the coming years, the levels of hydrocarbons coming out. So we're talking, in fact, the Saudi oil minister said a couple of years ago, every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So they are not in any way thinking about reducing levels of production of these fossil fuel commodities. There's two things to kind of bring into this, though. One is that a lot of there's been a historic shift in the way that the Gulf's oil and energy resources are integrated into the bigger global political economy. It is no longer the case that Gulf oil and gas and the products, the refined products, petrochemicals and so forth that come from these fossil fuels, they no longer flow westward. They flow predominantly eastward to China in particular. Something like 70% of all the Gulf's oil exports now go east to China and East Asia. It's not no longer towards the west. And this has been accompanied by, again, thickening investments and foreign direct investment into petrochemical plants, ports, and other kinds of infrastructures of hydrocarbons in China and East Asia by the Gulf, and vice versa. So it's like these East-East interdependencies in between the Middle East and China, East Asia, have really something that's quite evident. And this is one of the reasons why there has been this boom in oil consumption globally over the last 10 to 15 years, associated with China's emergence as a major kind of center of global capital accumulation. So that's one thing that's very important. The second thing is that despite I've just made the point that every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. That is not to say that the Gulf states are not interested or pursuing renewable energy, in particular solar and wind and battery technology. They are moving headstrong into this sector. In fact, more than 50% of the Middle East renewable capacity these days are located in the Gulf. And this has only been, if you go back to 2018, it was something like 18%. So it's been remarkably rapid, this shift. So we're talking here about big solar panel schemes in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. We are talking here about the largest single site solar farm in the world is located in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. The biggest battery storage plant, I believe, is under construction in Saudi Arabia at the moment. So they are really ramping up this kind of expansion of renewables as well. Now, you might ask the question, why? Why is this the case? And here, I think, really points to something about fossil fuel or energy use more generally under capitalism. And this is something I tried to make the argument in Crude Capitalism, and others have made this argument, I think, very clearly as well, is that under capitalism, there is a tendency towards an ever-increasing throughput of energy associated with the logic of capitalism to continually expand commodity production. And what does this mean for energy use? It means that rather than seeing an energy transition as being the replacement of one energy source by another, it's an additive process. So if we look historically, the coal to oil transition that took place in the middle of the 20th century, it didn't see the end of coal. It wasn't as if oil kind of suddenly took over and then coal disappeared. Last year was the biggest amount of coal, gas, and oil produced ever in human history. It's just added on. It's like as a fossil fuel substrate, oil managed to increase the total quantity of energy. So we need to move away from this idea of thinking about energy use in relative terms rather than absolute terms. And this is precisely what's happening in the case of the Gulf, that we see an expansion of renewables added onto an expanding fossil fuel substrate, and this is a recipe for disaster, to be quite frank, because it doesn't mean that there's any kind of real, genuine attempt to keep those kinds of fossil fuels in the ground. And that's the final point I'll say on this is that these processes and these features of capitalist development, I think, link very clearly with the ways in which the Gulf states have taken a really prominent role in steering climate policy at the global level. If we look, for example, at the COP processes, obviously held in Dubai a couple of years ago, where you had the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company as the chair of the COP process. They are the ones who are making climate policy. If you look, for example, at the recent negotiations around plastics and a plastics treaty, a global plastics treaty, to try to limit the production of plastics obviously being an oil product, the opposition and the eventual stymieing of that treaty was led by Saudi Aramco. So you really see the ways in which the Gulf states are playing this role of steering climate policy in very dangerous ways. And the reason for this is, I'm not, again, trying to say that Western corporations are not culpable, or the United States as the largest emitter is not culpable, or any kind of historical roles of Western Europe and elsewhere. But the point being is that the Gulf states are able to play this role in part because their national oil companies give them a seat at the table when it means that Saudi Aramco is basically in the room when these treaties are being decided upon. So they play a very much complementary and very damaging role with the kind of Western fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. I'd love to have you back to discuss the possible mechanisms of democratic, citizen-based agitation that can occur within both the private and the national sector of the oil economy. But I want to move back to Palestine as we began. In essence, my question here is to first start from this kind of macro perspective you've been articulating about the meaning of imperialism in the wider region. Obviously, in the history of Marxist thought, the very concept of imperialism in recent times has been put under scrutiny by different thinkers. I'm thinking, for example, of Hart and Negri's Empire series, where they kind of say, well, the age of imperialism is kind of over, right? And people now speak about geopolitics instead of imperialism. But I was refreshed to see in your forthcoming book, Resisting Erasure, that you re-invoke imperialism. So first, maybe a few definitions of that, and how maybe also the sort of logic, right, of imperialism in this region. What is it indexed to? What are its forces that kind of perpetuate imperialism? And then I want to dig down deeper into the crisis in Gaza.
Yes. So, I mean, I think there is a problem in the way that I think imperialism is often spoken about on the left. And that is, I think it's too often reduced to simply military, some kind of military intervention, whether that be straight out war or some kind of, violent intervention. Now, obviously, that is important. It's part of the way imperialism functions. But I really think it's important to think about imperialism as a form of global capitalism, where you see, large capitalist conglomerates, whether you want to call them finance capital or not, dominating most of the world. And what that entails is the kind of changing of social relations in the dominated spaces. There's a lot we could talk about here. I think the question of value transfers globally is a really important part of thinking about that and the different kinds of mechanisms through which that happens. But it means highlighting and thinking about imperialism not simply in its military dimensions, but in its financial dimensions, the questions of debt, for example, foreign direct investments and how that might bring value flows back to the core, and so forth. And by foregrounding these kinds of processes, we see that imperialism, and here I would differ with some of the kind of, maybe views of the dependency theorists or world systems approaches, which I think in some ways don't pay enough attention to the ways in which kind of imperial domination has shaped class formation in those dominated spaces, and produced class layers like those in the Gulf that are deeply integrated with the centers of Western power. And benefit from these processes. We need to call that out directly and understand those processes in thinking about how imperialism operates. So, I mean, in the case of the Middle East, the big question here is obviously that question of oil. What happened in the middle of the 20th century after the Second World War is that with the decline of British and French colonial control over the region, the US emerged as the dominant imperial power through the 50s and 60s as British and French colonialism fell away. And what did that mean? It was really deeply connected to the coal to oil transition that took place at the same moment. The US was the dominant oil power, and it taking the dominant position of imperial power in the Middle East was part of how it managed to secure its kind of global hegemony as the leading capitalist power in that post-war period. So how did the US do that practically? It was fundamentally around the alliance with two main regional allies, one being Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies. So the US, secured the position of these monarchies. It guaranteed their survival, their protection. It also, very importantly, ensured that the petrodollar surpluses that were accumulating in the Gulf, particularly after in the 1970s, were integrated very closely with an American-centered global financial architecture. So petrodollar surpluses from Saudi Arabia ended up coming back into the US through treasury bonds, buying of treasury bonds, investment into US stock markets, and extremely importantly, the arms trade. The Gulf area is the largest consumer of military hardware globally today. It remains in that position today. And it's the majority of, not the majority, but the largest proportion of American arms sales go to Saudi Arabia. So, it's really important to think about this kind of link between militarism, the circulation of these financial surpluses that ultimately derive from oil, and the US financial system, domination of the US financial system. So that was the first pillar. The second pillar, of course, was Israel, particularly after the 1967 war. So, that US-Israel alliance, in 1967 and since then, Israel has really proven its ability to act in ways that support and protect American interests in the region, and that has meant the destruction of the kind of Arab nationalist anti-colonial struggles through the 67 war and onwards. This is explicitly described by American political leaders. We can see Alexander Haig. We quote in our book that a quote from Alexander Haig, who was Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. He made the comment that Israel is the largest, to paraphrase something, largest aircraft carrier, which carries no American soldiers but will act in our interests, essentially. And that, I think, that fundamental relationship goes so far in explaining why this U.S. alliance with Israel is it's nonpartisan. It's continued for many decades. It's why the U.S. gives carte blanche to Israel. It defends Israel on the global stage and funds Israel militarily and financially. So these two pillars, Israel and the Gulf, is really how American power in the region has operated since, particularly since the 1970s. And the emphasis in recent decades has really been to try to knit together these two powers through normalizing the relationships between the Gulf and Israel, to see these pillars come together under a US kind of umbrella, and really, I think, in this way, kind of reassert American primacy in the region. And that, I think, is really the kind of contemporary way that imperialism is operating in the Middle East as a whole.
Thank you for that. And for listeners that are thinking about the tragedy in Gaza, the genocide, everything that has been unfolding, I wanted to throw onto the table and invite you to comment to help us get a more historical precision on the events leading up to October 7th and even the realities of the brutality of this onslaught that the Palestinians in Gaza are facing, Edward Said referred to the collapse of the Oslo Accords as the equivalent to the Versailles for the Palestinians, which I thought was a very pessimistic claim, but also perhaps very realist. And then we obviously have the ascension and the rise of Hamas in 2006, 2007. And they stand for almost like the return to a national struggle that was foreclosed by Oslo. But then more recently, 2016, 2017, under Trump, we had the Abraham Accords, which constituted, well, if they were successful, and in some cases they were, but they were not totally successful because Saudi Arabia did not sign on to them, but everyone knew that they were on the cusp of signing on to them. Many felt that if that were to have happened, everything would be lost in terms of the Palestinian liberation struggle for self-independence, and normalization, resisting normalization, would be out the window. So could you speak about that post-Oslo reality and some of the ways that the Palestinian liberation movement has tried to resist the encroaching normalization from these regional Arab partners, but of course from the US and Israel, who are sort of pulling the strings to do this? Because I feel that it's that moment that is most vital to understand the kind of the result of the post October 7th situations we're facing.
Yeah, the Oslo period is really an essential part of understanding what is going on today. And unfortunately, I think it's something that's dropped from the consciousness of so many people. And, particularly given that so many millions of people globally now have been won to solidarity with Palestine, but I think have a poor understanding of actually what Oslo was about. So just to briefly recap, Oslo was a so-called peace agreement. It was billed as a peace agreement in the mid-1990s, and it was billed at the kind of public level in the media as kind of a step towards Palestinian statehood and peace in the region. In reality, and here is where I think Edward Said's writing is so important and so, if you like, prescient about actually what Oslo was about. He was one of the few Palestinian voices who said, actually, no, this is not about liberation. It is actually about subcontracting the mechanisms and the structures of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza to a Palestinian face, and that was the way it did unfold in exactly that way, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, headquartered now in Ramallah in the West Bank, and the PA was given, if you like, some authority over these kind of truncated territories in the West Bank and Gaza initially. And the problem being that this control was really integrated into the way that the Israeli occupation functioned. So Israel controlled the borders, the economy, and any kind of movement in and out of these territories. The Palestinian Authority became extremely heavily reliant on external financial transfers from Europe and other kinds of donors, Gulf donors, and elsewhere. And in return, the PA really kind of played this role of dominating or allowing Israel's occupation to continue, but without an immediate Israeli military presence in the face of Palestinians on a day-to-day basis. That's what Oslo achieved from the Israeli perspective. So I've written elsewhere that we shouldn't see Oslo as a failure. It actually succeeded, if you believe what Edward Said and others said at the time. It did exactly what it intended to do. Now, the other dimension to Oslo, which was really, really key, and it was a big part of the way it was promoted at the time, was the regional integration of Israel into the wider Middle East. So as part of the Oslo negotiations and in subsequent years, there were a series of summits, Middle East summits, where Arab states, in particular Jordan and Egypt, normalized their economic relations with Israel. There were joint investment zones established in both those countries. Again, the US was really cheerleading this process and leading it on. The US was speaking at one point about the new Middle East and a Middle East free trade area that would basically see a free trade zone across the whole region that would be integrated into American dominance. It's interesting to think about that kind of language in today's world, because Trump himself is also, when he visited Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago, his language was, we need commerce, not chaos, for the region. So again, this language of economic normalization is there. So as I said, this knitting together of these two major pillars of American power, the Abraham Accords was a big step in that. And I think if we're thinking about the attitude of Saudi Arabia in this, because you're absolutely right, Saudi Arabia is the kind of the key in all of this. Under the Abraham Accords, we had the UAE and Bahrain normalize with Israel, and actually a free trade agreement signed between the UAE and Israel a couple of years later. But I would say that would not and could not have happened without Saudi acknowledgement and support. There is no doubt in my mind that Saudi Arabia would normalize with Israel when the time comes. Now, the big question is which Palestinians are going to give the green light to that process of normalization to take place. And here again, it comes back, I think, to the Palestinian Authority. And I think at some point, as it's very clear in the kinds of discussions about all these post-war scenarios, the meetings that happened in Washington a few days ago, at which Tony Blair was present, who was also majorly involved in kind of the Oslo process as well. The talk is about how to secure the conditions for this kind of normalization agreement to take place. And unfortunately, I think Saudi Arabia is quite willing to go ahead. And I think eventually the Palestinian Authority will unfortunately give the green light for that to happen.
So you think even after Saudi's response to the strikes on Iran, which were in favor of Iran, I mean, there was a sort of a shift that seemed to be evident. You perceive their interests to be fundamentally sort of compromised against the objectives of the long-standing Palestinian liberation movement in general.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's been the case historically. It's not something that's new.
I see. So you've written an incredible essay that I was recently reading about the prospects of statehood in Palestine. And I believe this was written prior to the current genocide. I wanted to run your thoughts on this precise potential of a one-state solution. You raise a number of very, very fascinating points about how we conceptualize the state away from what you refer to as the neoliberal conceptualization or the neo-Weberian conceptualization. And you think that in Palestine in particular, it's the forces of civil society that should be determining a future state. What does that mean? So putting aside the question about the geopolitical and kind of realpolitik situation, how do you theorize the proposal of a one-state solution in Palestine? What does this look like? And can you kind of maybe give some flesh on the bones to this idea? And maybe, I mean, thinking about it in relationship to the current genocide would, of course, be essential.
Yes, I think there's a couple of key points that emerge around this. One is that, again, to bring it back to Oslo, what did Oslo do politically for the Palestinian movement? What effects did it have, impact did it have politically on the Palestinian movement? It created this kind of Bantustan situation, as it's often described, where you have the Palestinian Authority as the intermediary between Israeli occupation and Palestinians in the West Bank, propped up and supported through European and Western interests. But the other thing it did was it narrowed the Palestinian body politic to simply these slithers of territory, now mostly in the West Bank. So what did that do? It broke apart the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and that is exactly one of the roots of this current genocide. The Gaza Strip was a creation, if you like, of the Oslo process. So there's a line that connects the current moment with that 1990s Oslo experience. The other thing, very important part of the Palestinian body politic, of course, are the refugees, Palestinian refugees, who make up the majority of Palestinians, the Palestinian population, dispersed across many countries in the region. We may be facing another kind of wave of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. But what Oslo did was it made the demand for the right of return of those Palestinian refugees, basically it took it off the table. And this was another a kind of aim, if you like, of Oslo at the time, was to really narrow the vision of Palestine just to these bartering over these slithers of territory, forgetting the question of refugees. And then the third very, very important part of the Palestinian population are Palestinian citizens of Israel itself, making up today about 20% of the Israeli citizen population are Palestinians who remained on their land in 48. So the call for a one-state or a single-state solution is in part, I think, in the long run, the only way of kind of dealing with these various fragments and bringing Palestinians back to Palestine in that sense. A state for all its citizens, rather, regardless of what ethnic, religious, national beliefs that you might have. Now, this is not. The kind of call for a one-state solution is something that's come at various moments in the history of the Palestinian national liberation movement. Various factions have put it forward. I think it kind of lost a lot of its kind of impetus with the rise of this kind of statehood language and the two-state solution that was really pushed forward falsely, as I said, in the case of the Oslo, post-Oslo. But I do think in the long run, it's the kind of way of kind of reaching justice. Now, the point is, however, that this is not a solution that I think can simply be a blueprint that's imposed or will develop in the context of just Palestine. It's something that will require this bigger regional transformation because the question of Palestine is so bound up with regional politics. So I wouldn't say, it's like prioritizing one or the other, if you like. The regional change has to occur in tandem and will push forward, I think, the changes in Palestine. These are kind of dialectically related, if you like.
And do you find the common analogy between South Africa at the peak of its apartheid oppression to contemporary Israel to be an apt analogy? And if so, it seems to me that the overcoming of that was very much reliant on the pressure exerted by international agitation and struggle. And of course, in Resisting Erasure, you and your co-authors really articulate some of the strategies from BDS to other, and I want to invite you actually to speak about in our final time together, some of the strategies that we in the United States and in Great Britain and elsewhere from outside can use to exert pressure on Israel, and what the prospects might be for the reform of Israeli governance. Obviously, we hear the idea, well, if it's just, there's hundreds of thousands of Israelis taken to the street to get rid of Netanyahu. But we seem to also recognize that the problem extends far deeper than that. Do you agree? And what might be some historical analogies that might point to a more realistic roadmap for the reform of Israeli political and social life?
Yes. The analogy, to begin perhaps with the question you raised about the analogy between South African apartheid and Israel. I think this analogy is important, and but it's important for a few different reasons. One is obviously there's the question of like different sets of forms of racial discrimination and racism, and there's plenty of examples that we could talk about that facing Palestinian populations inside Israel, outside Israel, in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as in comparison to the South African system of racial, racial order. But I think one of the things that's often forgotten in the case of South African apartheid is that South Africa's system of racial domination was not simply a question of internal politics. It was very much connected to South Africa's place as an agent, if you like, of Western imperialism in the African continent. This is why Britain and the United States in particular were such storied supporters of South African apartheid all the way to the end. It's not an accident that we see the same, literally in some cases, the same voices defending Israel today,
right,
as the ones that were defending South African apartheid. David Cameron is
in other words, the
example.
analogy is more accurate than we often assume.
Yes, but when we talk about, I think this is the thing I was trying to say about, when we think about settler colonialism, it's not simply something that happens in the territory that is colonized. It's part of a global system. It's part of an imperial system. And it takes different forms in different parts of the world. So if we look at the South African apartheid experience, we look at class and labor in that context, we see that the Black population in South Africa was the core of the South African working class in key sectors like mining and so forth. That is different from the Palestinian example. Palestinians played a very important role in some sectors, but they are not the dominant or major part of the working class across Israel, Palestine. That's not the case. It's much more in this kind of reserve army of labor structure that I mentioned earlier. If we look at Canada or Australia, we see different examples again. So it's important to be cognizant of these different kind of class structures, to map them concretely and think concretely and to think about them, but again, place it in the bigger picture. So to move to the question of kind of the strategies around this, I do think this the example of the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement in the case of Palestine is really really important. It is, I think, important to recognize, however, that the BDS movement isn't just an invention of Western activists or a recent invention. It's something that's really been part of the Palestinian movement for many decades. The idea, and at the heart of it, is this idea of no normalization with the Israeli state. So all of the processes we were talking about in the last few questions around potential paths of normalization, Abraham Accords, BDS is in many ways at the core of those normalization agreements. Resisting those normalization agreements is exactly what the BDS movement is about in the context of Palestine, in the context of the region. So that's important. It's not just a matter of like picking a consumer target in the West and saying, I'm not going to buy from that place. I do think it's important for the solidarity movement on a number of levels, because what does BDS do? It does, I think, put pressure on the Israeli state, and it illuminates the kind of structures of power that exist to support Israel. And in that sense, it plays, I think, a really important role in raising political consciousness for people in the West and elsewhere, to kind of understand how US or Israel, UK or Israel, wherever it might be, are so deeply connected, whether it be through military ties, financial ties, and so forth. So I think one of the big gains, if you like, of the last couple of years in terms of solidarity movement is a much deeper understanding of these ties, and I think some very successful, limited, and obviously, it hasn't. We're still faced with the enormity of the genocide, but there have been very heroic and inspiring actions by workers in different ports, workers in military factories, the call for the energy embargo on Israel, calls to cut ties with Israeli military and tech firms. All of these kinds of things, I think, are really important in terms of deepening the kind of consciousness around Palestine more broadly in places like the UK and US.
Yeah, I am always hesitant to put too much stock in public opinion, because I know how fickle public opinion is and how ephemeral it is. I suppose my sort of final question is about the degree to which we might envision Gaza becoming divvied up according to the Kushner-Abraham Accords vision, which is, to be clear, an absolutely absurd and monstrous vision of a kind of casino Riviera. We've all seen in the Financial Times, they had, I don't know if it was leaked, but it was the PowerPoint slides of what Gaza would be. I guess two parts is, could you ever envision the strong arming of this happening, and what mechanisms are there that would prevent this from happening? Because I fear that this juggernaut of the imperialist machine of Israel and the United States is seemingly moving in this direction. And does that sound, despite the absurdity of it, and maybe you could explain what their vision is briefly, does that sound at all plausible? I suppose what they've done and the brutality, the scale of the genocide is such that maybe anything is possible. But what would you say to that possibility of the kind of Witkoff Trumpist vision of Gaza? Does it have any legs? How can we stop it?
I think the one important place to start here is to recognize that these kinds of fantastical schemes have a long pedigree. Explicitly in the case of Gaza. Back in the Oslo years, Gaza was frequently described as being on the cusp of becoming a Singapore on the sea. And this was these kinds of schemes where the area is seen as being a hub of financial activity, economic activity, entrepreneurship, and so forth. Is being repeatedly mobilized over the last 30 years. And I think the latest kinds of discussions are no exception to that general trend. I think it's important to understand this, though, less in terms of, is this realistically going to be the case, rather than understanding ideologically and performatively, what do these schemes actually, what role do they play? And what they play, I think, is ultimately pushing forward this notion of normalization between the Gulf and Israel, mediated by the Americans, in which the Egyptians will play a role, the Palestinian Authority will play a role, whatever kind of configuration we see. It kind of like legitimizes, if you like, those kinds of moves. The other side to this, which I think is actually a reality, unfortunately, or potentially has the ability to become a reality, is something called IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which fits very much into these kinds of schemes for Gaza. IMEC was a proposal that was put forward before 2023. I think it was a few months before 2023, which linked, it was about setting up an energy and economic corridor that linked India with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, into Europe, into Greece in particular. And it's around energy, it's around EVs, it's around all sorts of kinds of things. It was promoted by those countries. The European Union supported it very much, as well as the US. The US really saw this as being a counterpoint to the Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East area. So you see these competing visions, and at the heart of them is this kind of normalization that really links that together. Now, IMEC, you might think, well, that must have all disappeared with the onset of the genocide, but actually that's not the case. Post 2023, the UAE, Israel, India have reaffirmed their commitment to this, and in fact have actually taken practical steps forward in this. So, if you look at the kind of the maps that are being put forward by these various consultancy groups around Gaza, or Netanyahu's maps that he showed at one point at the United Nations, Gaza was IMEC was kind of Gaza was integrated into this IMEC chain. So again, it's about thinking about the ways in which these, they're not. Gaza is not going to be the center of EV production globally, as it's been, one aspect of this, but it is the kind of ideological role that this plays in legitimizing these kinds of normalization agreements is really important to highlight.
Brilliant. Professor Hanieh, I want to thank you for your time and for coming on Emancipations podcast. It was extremely, extremely illuminating and informative to gain your perspective. This is the side to the conflict that I think is extremely important, because part of what we didn't talk about is the kind of Islamophobic, racist narrative that frames the conflict in kind of, religious terms. And of course, religion's part of it, but too often we don't examine the true material, political, economic dynamics that underpin all of this. And you've helped us to do that. And for that, we're very grateful. And we hope everyone picks up Resisting Erasure, this important new book, and that everyone does what they can to follow some of the prescriptions in the book. It's a very readable book. I think only 150 pages, right?
Yes, that's right.
With Verso, I'll link to it in the show notes. But thank you, everyone, for your time and for listening. And thank you, Professor Hanieh, very much.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you. Should I
hold on one second there.